That's why I reach out. We can talk. First of all, I'm sure you follow some kind of news on Iran, Afghan refugees in Iran, and Blazing Car. The video went viral, and also in May, some of the Afghan refugees dropped in water, which was like devastating for Afghans, since a lot of protests are going on against Iran as well. What is your reaction when you see Iran action and also Afghan response?
Well, I mean, the situation, I mean, the interesting thing from Norwegian Refugee Council perspective is we're working with Afghan refugees in Iran, and then we're also, of course, working in Afghanistan. So, I mean, we're doing the best we can to respond to the needs of the Afghans in Iran, trying to protect them and take measures that will limit their exposure to the pandemic. At the same time, 250,000 as of the middle of April, it's probably more by now. 250,000 Afghans had returned from Iran to Afghanistan, facing a lot of hostility and suspicion upon their return, because everyone, the people in Afghanistan know that there was such a serious outbreak in Iran. So the Afghans are kind of caught in the middle in a very difficult situation.
Yeah, it's both COVID and the war. So what kind of awareness programs have you implemented so far for COVID and people like refugees coming back? You have some awareness programs.
Yeah, we're doing the best we can to raise awareness, to do water and sanitation programming in places where people are more stable. And then we're also very concerned about the food situation. So we're also doing, we're providing cash assistance to people so that they can purchase food. The difficulty being that because of the impact of the pandemic, food prices are rising in Afghanistan between 10 and 20%. So it's a challenging situation because people are already food insecure, billions of people. And, with food prices rising, that situation is only going to get worse.
Yeah, I also saw on your Facebook that NRC is also dealing with refugees, as you said, inside Iran with the displaced camps, also with refugee camps in Afghanistan. I mean, with your observation, your workers, how they're dealing with COVID, how they're taking it?
Well, the real challenge in Afghanistan, apart from here we are, decades of war, a very disrupted health situation, conflict continuing, and now on top of this, you have the pandemic. And it's just, I'm not saying it's impossible to do anything, but it's incredibly challenging. So, and we were trying to expand the scope of our work, as you said, to do awareness raising, to do health and sanitation work, to do the cash assistance. But basically, without a major response from international donors to the situation, and without a major response from the Afghan government, it's going to be very difficult for us alone or as an aid community to overcome this situation. Now, we had hoped that there would be a ceasefire. The UN Secretary General, the third week in March, called for a global ceasefire in the light of the pandemic, not only in Afghanistan, but in all conflict-affected countries, basically saying, lay down your arms in the interests of the people so that we can respond effectively. I think there was some discussion in Afghanistan of a possible ceasefire, but in the end, it didn't happen, and it continues. I think something on the order of 250,000 people have been displaced by conflict over the last year or so. That's on top of 2 million internally displaced people already. So it's a pretty challenging situation.
Also, NRC released a new report on most neglected displaced crisis in 2019. How do you define a place most neglected? I mean, refugees are everywhere.
Yeah, so that's a good question. Basically it's a comment. We look at the scale of the need, the amount of media attention that it's getting, and the amount of response from the international community. And what we found this year is that 9 of the 10 neglected crises were in Africa, reflecting the overall lack of international attention that those crises tend to get, with Cameroon at the top of the list. So it's a combination of scale, media and other diplomatic initiatives and so on, or lack thereof, and then a focus on, well, at the end of the day, how much money, how much of a response is there to the crisis. So the thing about, so why it's in Afghanistan on that list? Well, fundamentally, compared to many crises, Afghanistan is actually getting a lot of attention, certainly a political attention, but we're not in any way implying that the situation in Afghanistan is not a crisis. It absolutely is. It's just the list of neglected crises. We look at, where's the world really focused?
Yeah.
They're not focused on the countries that we list.
Also, there are 26 million of refugees around the world, and half of it children, with almost like quarter in the countries with poorest countries. I mean, how do you prioritize your work? Where to go?
That's a really good question. I think we start again. We start with the scale. NRC, Norwegian Refugee Council, focuses on countries that are experiencing conflict rather than responding to natural disasters. So we're focusing on conflict-affected countries, the scale of the crisis, and then to some extent, truly, we're driven in part by donor interest and what we can get funding for. So sometimes we just have to admit that we're donor driven in the sense of maybe we want to do more in the Central African Republic, for example, but there's so little donor interest that it's hard to get that program to the scale that's needed. But I think if you ask anyone, what are the major crises, we're in all of them. I mean, we're working in Syria, we're working in Iraq, we're working in Yemen, in Afghanistan, in the Western Hemisphere, we're responding both inside Venezuela and to the crisis in the wider region with the outflow. So at some level, at the end, it's not that hard to priorities. So just the scale.
Sure, and also the last question, don't want to take too much of your time. How UNHCR, also NRC and other NGOs, they're dealing with effect of these refugees, displacement, beyond aid, like trauma. Like a lot of children are affected with the conflict, and they run away, they lose their parents and houses, and they go to this place. Do you have special programs for these children, for these people with trauma?
Our focus is on that spectrum. Our focus is more on youth. That's the kind of area we've carved out. So not the youngest children, but children maybe high school age or in their teens and so on. And we do a combination of education and psychosocial support depending on the situation and what kind of difficulties, what kind of trauma people have experienced. It's not an easy thing to respond to. There's the core that we try to do is create a safe place for children or youth, try to get them to maybe talk about what they've experienced, I've seen a little bit. I saw one program that we're supporting in Syria that was dealing with psychological trauma. But our approach tends to be more focused on education and creating a safe place for for children and youth.